Alright, so front rotor coming off. Front rotor is a little bit more difficult. I mean, it's basically the same procedure. You're going to remove the caliper from the housing. You're going to have these two bolts going from your caliper into your housing, going into here. And these actually thread into here, unlike the rear. And you got these two. There's 22 mil bolts that go in here and here to attach the housing to the front rotor. Now, this is a lot more heavy duty because most of your braking power comes from your front end, so everything's got to be a little bit more beefed up, a little tougher. As you can see, the housing is quite a bit bigger than it was in the rear. Brake pads are larger as well for the front than they are for the rear. Your bolts holding your housing in are bigger. Everything's just a little bit more beefy for the front end. So once you've taken the caliper off, I just got it set up here for now. You take the housing off. There's two bolts holding it in, one here, one here. You're going to be able to take your rotor off. The rotor is going to give you a lot of trouble. Like I said, you can hit it with a hammer around here. As you turn it, keep hitting it, turn it and hitting it, but you run the risk of, hitting your rotor. You don't want to do that unless it's a bad rotor and you're just trying to get it off, then you can beat the crap out of it. But try not to hit it. Try to keep hitting it here. Tap on it here too. What you're trying to do is break everything loose inside of there. It's got a lot of rust from brake dust has been in there and rusting over ever how long it's been on there, so it's going to be tough to get off. So what I found works is after you tap on it a little bit, you get one of these called a lady foot, or like an alignment punch with a lady foot on the end of it, and you can come back here and you can actually place it inside there and just push a little bit against your rotor. Turn the rotor, push a little bit more, turn, push, keep turning and pushing, and you'll feel it slowly starting to back its way off of there. Don't pull, push on it too hard in one area, because you'll start bending your lug nuts and everything, and you're in for another problem altogether. But you can put it in back in here against here and just pry against your rotor a little bit. Turn it, pry a little more, turn, pry, keep going until you work the whole thing off, and eventually it'll get to the point where it'll just pop like that. Then you can take the whole thing off. So here's the front rotor, and there's your bearing, your front bearings. As if you ever have to do like a bearing change, or bearing change you do from the back, because you got bolts back there inside there that, I don't know if you can see them, bolts back inside there that hold your bearing housing on. But if you got to change your drive shaft, like obviously I need to do, you'll have to take this nut off, cotter pin out, nut comes off, and you should be able to pull it out from there. That's a whole nother fiasco though that I'm not going to get into. So that's basically it for that. What I can show you here is the way your brake pads are going to go into the front housing, because you'll notice you got these little tabs now, little tabs sticking out right here. You don't have those on the rear, so they're going to actually go into these little loops right there. When you put the brake pad in, same kind of deal. You just find the slot for the rear of it. There's a little spring there that it's going to set against, and when you bring in the front end down to go into its slot, this is obviously easier to do while it's on the car, but this will end up going right in that hole, and it kind of gives a little pressure back on it so you don't drag them so much. But what I'll do is I'll put the rotor back on, housing back on, and then I'll show you how to put the brake pads in. Alright, time to put the brake pads back in. We got the housing back on, tightened it down, 22 mil bolt, tighten the housing back down, housing's nice and tight. Rotor's still a little wobbly because I haven't hasn't seated itself yet from having the tire put back on, but that's okay. So here's your brake pads. When you get them, you're gonna have this thing on the front. That's how you can tell they're front brake pads and not rear brake pads. The rear brake pads will not have this. The rear brake pads are going to be a lot smaller than that as well. So these are front pads. These are the ones that were already on. I'm just going to go ahead and put them back on. Same deal. It's a little easier working up front because you can turn the front tire back and forth so you can get to it to work on it a lot easier than the rear. But same as before, this side's going to go against your rotor. You're going to have this curved part here, needs to correspond with the curved part on this side of the brake pad. And what you're going to do is take it, set that down in that slot there, and a little spring there, put some pressure on it, come up top here. Now this is where you're going to have to be paying attention to what you're doing. Once you get it lined up with the front, you need to make sure that that tab falls in place with it like that. And it's gonna try to push the brake pad back out, but that's all right. You know, you got it in there the right way. That tab from the housing should go inside that hole from the rotor, or from the brake pad. So on the rear, you're gonna do the same thing. Make sure that side's going against your caliper, or against your against your rotor. Yeah, don't go against the caliper. Find your slot down there, push back against that spring a little bit, and your slot up top. Make sure you push this little tab to go into that hole, and there you go. Now it's in. Now your front brake pads are in. You just replaced your front brake pads. Now the same with the rear. You're gonna take your caliper. Heavy. Make sure you don't have any crazy twists or bends in your brake line. But again, you should not have to drain or bleed your brakes at all. If you don't open up the system, there should be no air in the system. And these newer vehicles like this is a 2012 Altima, but newer vehicles like this, the system bleeds itself. It pumps its own air out of the system. So it's not like older ones where you got to remove this and start pumping the brakes and all that crap. It should bleed itself. I mean, that's not 100% because sometimes you do get air in the system. You can get bubbles in the system, and then you'll have to bleed them. That's why they leave you the bleeder valve. But you'll feel it when you push the brakes. The anti-lock brake systems now, they've fixed that, so you don't have to worry about that so much. But anyway, here we go. Here's your piston back here. That's your piston. So if you do need to compress it, you're going to take a clamp and put the clamp edge here and tighten it down ever so gently. You should be able to squeeze it back far enough to get over your new brake pads if you run into trouble. I would attempt to put this on like this first before I started compressing the piston, because it may slide right on just like that, and then you don't have to fool with compressing your piston, because that can be a bit of a pain in the butt. Not the easiest of jobs. So once that's back on, you're gonna this is the part that moves here, so you can pull it out to see, it's trying to retract it right now because there's a spring on the inside of there, but you can put your bolt through. As you can see, it's going to try to thread into that. So as you're tightening that, you may need to get a wrench and hold the other end of that. Let's see if that works. No, it's bigger than a 9/16, so it's probably like a 5/8, which I don't seem to have handy right now. But yeah, I think it's a 5/8. But you'll hold one end while you tighten the other end. That way it's, you don't sit there trying to tighten something that ain't doing nothing. Same on the bottom. And line these up. And in there, start turning that and tighten those down. And that's basically it. You've changed your front brake pads. Pretty easy job. Let's see, what did I use? 9/16 here. I believe it's 5/8 there. I will verify. These are 22 mil bolts to take the housing off, and then I just use my little handy dandy lady foot to pry the rotor off. But I will verify that. But like I said, if you're just changing your brake pads, you don't need to take your housing off. All you need to do is remove the caliper, take the old brake pads out, put the new ones in, make sure that the tab goes in place where it's supposed to go. Put your caliper back on, tighten the bolts up, and you're done. Okay, so it's not 5/8. It's like a 3/4 or 19 mil. We'll hold that in place while you use the 9/16 on the back to tighten that. There you go. So another thing with the changing the brake pads, don't be alarmed when you tighten this back up and that comes out looking like that. All stretched out like that. Same on the bottom. Don't let that bother you, because the first time you hit the brakes, what's going to happen is you're putting pressure against the piston here. The piston's pushing against this brake pad on this side, and it'll pull the whole caliper that way. So everything will tighten back up and align back up, and it'll look real nice. So nothing to worry about. Just make sure you get everything put back together, tighten down. Make sure you tighten down all the bolts and nuts that you took off to start with. Put your tire back on, put your lug nuts on, tighten it down real good, put it on the ground, then step on the brakes a couple of times. Be sure it's gonna act right. Just drive real slow, hit the brakes, be sure everything acts right, and that's basically it.